Hello everyone, welcome to a new ITSS Verona member series video podcast. My name is Camilla Braito and with my colleague Giulia Panfilo, we're part of the Russia and post-Soviet space team.
In the context of the war in Ukraine, several peace plans have been drafted so far, but all appear to exclude a crucial part of the population, which is the women. So today, once again, through this interview, we aim to examine the role of women's and feminist organizations in Ukraine at this critical juncture.
We're delighted to have Dr. Graziella Piga with us for this video podcast. Dr. Piga is an international expert, researcher, and practitioner with over 20 years of experience in gender equality, human rights, and the women, peace, and security agenda. She has worked extensively in conflict-affected and transition contexts across Central Asia, the South Caucasus, and Ukraine, including 11 years in long-term field missions, collaborating with organizations such as UN Women, the OSCE, and the European Union. She holds a Master of Science in Development Practice with a focus on sexual and gender-based violence and the protection of refugee women, and a PhD in Gender and Politics from the University of Surrey, where she is also a research fellow. Her research focuses on the implementation of the EU Women, Peace and Security Agenda in Ukraine. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Piga.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, so let's start our interview. What is peace building, and to what extent can we talk about peace building today in Ukraine?
Okay, thank you very much for this very important question. So, peace building really refers to a broad set of efforts that are aimed at creating a sustainable and long-lasting peace after, but sometimes even during the conflict. So it goes beyond simply stopping the violence, which I would call a ceasefire or peacekeeping, and instead it tries to address the deeper causes of conflict, such as political exclusion, economic inequality, weak institutions, and social division. If we remember, there was a very famous Norwegian scholar, Johan Galtung, and he distinguished between negative peace, which is the absence of violence, and positive peace, which is the presence of justice, equality, stable institution, and a societal attitude that foster peace. So peace building is really a multidimensional and typically includes really 5 pillars that have many subcomponents. So when I think about peace building, I think about political institutional reform, so strengthening the rule of law and democratic processes, security sector reform, so demobilizing armed groups, reforming the military, the police, intelligence service, economic recovery, social reconciliation, and civil society engagement. And yes, I think we can talk about peace building in Ukraine because the case of Ukraine is very complex because the country is still in an active and high intensity conflict following the invasion by Russia of Ukraine. But this raises also an important issue. Peace building is usually most effective after, the large-scale violence has decreased. So at present, it's difficult to speak about full peace building, in Ukraine for several reasons, because there is still an ongoing war, there is a lack of political settlement. And yet, despite these constraints, some aspects of peace building are already visible. For example, institutional resilience. Ukraine has strengthened democratic institutions even during wartime. It's maintaining governance structures and public trust, and this aligns with long-term peace-building goals. And something really important that is happening in Ukraine is civil society mobilization. So the Ukrainian civil society has been highly active, supporting displaced people, documenting war crimes, and fostering community solidarity. And these type of grassroots efforts are really crucial foundation for future reconciliation. And also when we look at, what international organizations are doing, like the European Union, the Council of Europe, the UN, the World Bank, they are all involved in reconstruction planning, anti-corruption reforms, and economic stabilizations. And these are classic peace-building components, even if they are implemented during a conflict. Another very important pillar of peace building is justice and accountability efforts. And this is something that is already happening, has started happening in Ukraine. For instance, there is a strong focus on documenting crimes and pursuing legal accountability. If we think about an organization like the Center for Civil Liberties, they are documenting war crimes, advocating internationally. The head of the NGO is Alexandra Matvichuk, who is a human rights lawyer, but is also a 2022 Nobel Peace Prize laureate. And she continues to bring forward Ukrainian voices and fight for accountability and access to justice, peace, and democracy. So this is a very important component of peace building process in Ukraine, from my point of view. So, we may say that Ukraine represents a major case study of peace building efforts during an ongoing war. And once the war will end, it will be even more important to ensure that peace building is implemented in all its pillars.
I think you just laid the foundation of our conversation. So that was super insightful. Thank you very much. If you want to dive a bit more into the role of women based on your research experience, what specific contributions are Ukrainian women making to peace building efforts?
So I've been working in and on Ukraine since 2014, before as a consultant, then as staff in the humanitarian response, and then again as a consultant. And I think, I can say that Ukrainian women have played a significant role in shaping not only the immediate response to war, which we all have seen on the media, we all have seen, women being very active, but also their contribution cuts across civil society, state institutions, and the private sector. And what is interesting is that they bring, a perspective that is centered on human security, gender equality, social cohesion, and accountability. And even in the middle of this, Russian invasion of Ukraine, women are actively engaged in activities that align very much with the peace-building principles. For example, women are very active in humanitarian leadership and community stabilization. So when I worked in the humanitarian response from 22 to 23, several of my colleagues and interlocutors were women. They were organizing aid for internally displaced. They were running shelters, education initiative, and trauma support programs. I then met and interviewed women for my research work. Women were working for international organization, and then they were risking their lives, daily, to maintain basic social services near the front line or distributing food. And also women are very, they're actually women-led groups that are collecting evidence of war crimes. And I already mentioned Alexandra Matvichuk, but there are also women who are supporting, survivors of violence, including conflict-related sexual violence. They are conducting training for police on these issues. I collaborated myself with, for example, your friend, the Association of Women's Lawyers, who with me conducted training for the police on issues of sexual harassment and on issues of gender responsive leadership. I met with prosecutors, brilliant prosecutors, were women who were really working very hard to improve their legal system. And so all these women actually, they're advocating also for an international accountability mechanism. And all these factors actually feed into, long-term transitional justice, which is a core pillar of peace building. Women are also very active in the dialogue and social cohesion. I traveled to different regions of Ukraine, but I remember very well, my travel to Sumy region, to Poltava, Odessa, where, you have women working, facilitating dialogue between displaced population and host communities. And, this is extremely important in a situation that is highly polarized and, during this wartime environment. And then women are also very active, and we see, in political participation and advocacy, not only in local governance, but also in national policy making and international advocacy forums. As I said, when I travel locally, in Sumy region, Ivaniska community in Chernihiv region, I travel in Kirovograd region. I met with local authorities, community mobilizers, working with the local authorities, and they were mostly women. They conducted gender profiles and identified specific security issues in their own communities. Issues, for example, of veterans and social inclusion were in their priority list, because this is something that will come up, once the conflict is over. But even now, that veterans are coming back home. And, these women were working at all levels also, and they are pushing for reconstruction policies that are inclusive and that they are socially sustainable. And also, something really important that is happening in Ukraine, that every year there is the Ukraine Recovery Conference with the support of a foreign government. And in 2024 in Berlin, the Gender Alliance was established to advocate internationally in a much more comprehensive way for an inclusive and just reconstruction. And ever since, the Gender Alliance is very active in coordination and advocacy and comprises several organizations, both national and international. And the government representative who is co-leading the alliance, Mrs. Levchenko. And so just to say that the civil society sector is extremely active, in all areas. And perhaps what I want to talk about is there is a very interesting concept that, Anderson wrote in her paper, on feminist peace building. She introduces the concept of peace continuum, which challenges the traditional binary approach to peace and conflict. And what I find interesting in this framework is that it highlights how grassroots feminist activists who are often excluded from formal peace process, they still persist in their peace building efforts, even when violence is still ongoing, when there are peace agreements that failed. And I think this is exactly what is happening in Ukraine. These formal peace agreements are failing. They are not even peace agreements. They are like initial negotiations, but there are still continuous efforts made at local and national level, with the women being at the center, to lay the foundation for peace building. And then the last point is really about women, in state and political institutions. We have seen that we do not see women in the formal, let's say, initial negotiations, but we see women increasing their presence at in the national government. For example, now the Prime Minister of Ukraine since July 2025 is a woman, Giulia, and she has been appointed also, I think, with the idea to accelerate reforms towards EU integration, because she was a former Minister of Economy. But we have also ministers in, the Minister of Environmental Protection, of Veterans Affairs, they are women. The Vice Prime Minister of Humanitarian Policy is a woman. And also, for example, in the Ministry of Interior, a very prominent Deputy Minister, Katerina Pavlichenko, she's very active in police reform issues, including in women in services. In the Ministry of Defense, the top leadership is male-dominated, but we had in the past prominent deputy ministers such as Hanna Maliar. And also, we should not forget about Olga Stefanishina. She was the Deputy Minister of European Integration and then later the Minister of Justice. She was very much engaged in legal reform, and she was extremely active, in coordination with international partners. And now she is the Ukrainian ambassador to the US. So this is a very, important post, and is held by women. So women are actually contributing from all sides. And I know very often we say they are not in these groups of delegations that we see, but they are working everywhere at every level. And also to complete, we have seen a lot on the news about women directly involved in defense, and women in fact serving the armed forces, the intelligence, territorial defense, and they contribute also in combat roles. And even though this may seem a bit counterintuitive, their participation in the war not only challenges traditional roles, but it also strengthens legitimacy of state institutions, but most importantly, position women to influence the post-war security sector reform. And, when we will be talking about, DDR, so demobilization, disarmament, reintegration, women will have a say. So I think this is the contribution that they are doing, and also maybe not just here, but I mean, what I see is that Ukrainian women are already central to peace building, but in a kind of a bottom-up and anticipatory sense, rather than in the formal post-conflict process.
Yes, indeed. And thank you for bringing this up, that one can also contribute to peace, not just in an official way or path, but also through civil society, which is bringing me to a question for you, since you covered also geographically many regions of Ukraine. What would a gender just peace in Ukraine look like for you?
Okay, this is a very complex questions, but for me, I mean, a gender just peace closely linked actually to the women, peace and security agenda, which emphasized that sustainable peace depends on gender equality and women meaningful participation. For me, it means, building a society in which women, men, and marginalized groups have equal rights, protection and influence over political, economic, and social life. So really thinking about, the international framework. And so there are like few pillars that for me are like fundamental. The first one will be like equal participation in decision making. So a gender just peace would ensure that women are not merely present, but they are also influential. They are influential in peace negotiation when this will occur. They are influential in constitutional and legal reform. They are influential in reconstruction planning and budgeting. And this is what the Gender Alliance is trying to do. Then another important pillar will be the justice and accountability for gender-based violence. So we know that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has involved documented cases of conflict-related sexual violence. And Ukraine has already taken significant steps in this direction. For example, within the Office of the Prosecutor General, there is a dedicated unit on conflict-related sexual violence, and this has been established to support the investigation and prosecution of acts of sexual violence that were committed during the armed conflict. So then for me, the gender just peace really includes this proper investigation and prosecution of these crimes, which is already happening, along with a survivor-centered approach and recognition of the harm also in the official narratives and reparation. And there is something also extremely important that is ongoing in Ukraine. For example, in 2022, after the large-scale invasion, the parliament ratified the Istanbul Convention. And this is also a central element towards a gender just peace, because Ukraine has already started to amend laws and policies to be in line with this convention. And this is a work that will continue after the conflict, but it has already started. And then another important pillar for gender just peace is economic equality and inclusive reconstruction. We know that the war had a very strong impact on women economically. Many have become head of a household, others face barrier to employment because of the displacement and care responsibilities. But at the same time, the war has been also a catalyzer, for women, entering new positions. So when I think about gender just peace, this will involve also about equal access to job in the reconstruction sector that is not just care work, and more support for women entrepreneurs and small businesses. During these last 2 years, the number of women entrepreneurs has risen enormously in Ukraine. So it will be really important also to recognize the work of caring for children, for elderly, for displaced, for disabled. There will be a lot of disabled people coming back home after, the end of the war, and this will have a great impact on women. And then something that it's something, new and not new is really closing the digital gap. In Ukraine, a study of 2020 revealed that there is a widening digital divide across several groups, including women, men, older and younger, and those living in urban and rural areas. So when we think about, gender just peace is also, address, this digital gap, in the post-war context. And linking to what I said before, there are so many women in the security sector reform. So if we want to have a gender just peace, we have to think about a gender responsive security sector reform where, we just don't think about having women in the armed forces, but also ensuring that they have the same opportunities and there is safeguards against harassment and discrimination. And I mentioned that this work has already started. I was myself part of this training, sexual harassment and gender responsive leadership. This work has to continue. And the same, gender just peace will really ensure that a proper disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration process includes women. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I think this question, your answer opens for some food for thought, to keep in mind. And you mentioned the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, so I would like to ask you, what is the current state of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in Ukraine, and have there been changes after the beginning of the war in 2022?
Yeah, this is again another very complex question because a lot is happening in Ukraine. So it's also difficult to follow up. And even when myself, I interview activists and ask, so who is doing what? Sometimes, some group of activists, they are not aware of what others are doing because there is so much that is happening. But from the formal point of view, Ukraine remained formally committed to the Women, Peace and Security Agenda through the National Action Plan. I think you know that Ukraine was the first country that adopted a NAP during an ongoing conflict in 2016, because we should not forget that the conflict started in 2014. And the first NAP was then, there was a midterm evaluation in 2018 and it was readjusted until 2020. Then the second NAP from 2020 to 2025 was 22 after the large-scale invasion to reflect the wartime realities. And I think the fact that there was an immediate reaction to update the NAP shows actually the commitment of the government and civil society, actually, and also the influence of the civil society. And this new NAP included new categories such as displaced people, survivors of sexual violence, and people in occupied territories. So formally, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in Ukraine is still in place, it's evolving, and I think from my point of view, should be also be taken as a lessons learned, because we always start from the resolutions, then we go to the NAP, and then we go to the implementation. I think in the case of Ukraine, we have to go bottom up, because a lot of what is happening is really a clear, let's say, tailoring to the Women, Peace and Security Agenda to a real conflict, to an ongoing conflict. So I think a lot of what is happening in Ukraine perhaps is not formally, specified in the resolutions, but actually it's something that is feeding, into the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and should be studied thoroughly. So when I think about the actual implementation, the implementation is uneven, and it's of course is constrained, because the war priorities dominate. There is a national survival and military defense that takes precedence. And also there is a limited state capacity, because there is occupation, there is displacement, there is resource shortage, and coordination also is an issue, because there are different actors, as I was mentioning before. When I worked myself on the actual response from 2022 to 2023, there were so many actors working in Ukraine, not just on the humanitarian response, but on women, peace and security, and not all of them are always aligned. And and the research also shows that there are some individual champions rather than, systematic policy integration. And I think also the fact that the NAP does not have really a budget attached to it and relies heavily on international funding is a bit problematic, because, USAID, for example, was a critical donor for the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. And with the dismantling of USAID, this has impacted also the work of, that was planned. Then, of course, Canada has stepped up, as well as Sweden, and the EU is currently the major donor, but it's funding Ukrainian reform and reconstruction through the Ukraine facility for, the EU accession. And And as I said, there is mixed awareness and political commitment. I was doing my self-training on women, peace and security for my colleague humanitarians. They never heard about the women, peace and and they were very, actively working on the humanitarian response. So the two should converge. And perhaps now they are converging more, but this did not happen immediately. And there are still a lot of parallel paths, if I may say so. And so after the 22 full-scale invasion, I think what has changed a lot is also there's been from a feminist point of view, the first and the most important shift has been in how peace is understood. For example, when I did the research for my PhD, I interviewed women and they were talking about peace building program and gender inclusion, and in a way that was collaborative with the Russian counterparts. But after 2022, security and survival became the precondition for peace. And the peace cannot be achieved if there is no state, and the Ukrainian identity is at stake. So this has made I think the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda a bit more problematic, because we know that when the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 was adopted, it was about a vision of world without war, a vision of peace. However, many governments and then the Ukrainian government had to focus largely on integrating women into militaristic and nationalized security structures. And this has a bit sidelined the peace aspect of peace and implementation. So basically, as I was mentioning before, with the large-scale invasion of Ukraine, there was this rupture, within the feminist movement, as some were calling for armament, whereas others were not. And I think make us also reflect if we think about how much money is spent, in armament, in military spending today. In 2024, it was 2.7 trillion, and this is much higher than what is spent on peace. And the second, perhaps, and most practical aspect of the, has been after 2022 has been actually the expansion of scope and urgency of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, because before 2022 the focus was largely in Donbass, and the emphasis was a lot also on women's participation in security and defense and peace building activities across the lines. But then the agenda has expanded nationwide, and there is a strong focus now on conflict-related sexual violence, mass displacement, trauma and rehabilitation, and reintegration of occupied territories. And I think the trauma and rehabilitation part, it will be perhaps the most complex and the most difficult to address, not only for the veterans that will come back home, but also for the civilian population that has been under bombing for so many years. And I think also what has changed after the large-scale invasion is that notwithstanding the divisions, we have seen a much stronger role of civil society. The civil society has rapidly adapted to humanitarian needs, and also has taken this role of documentation that I was mentioning before. And also a substantial funding has reached Ukraine after the large-scale invasion. This has created also opportunities for influence despite the crisis. So we have seen a lot of human rights, women's rights advocates that were protagonists of several events globally. And so their work also has gained invisibility and importance. And I think this greater visibility of women, it's very important. And this does not mean necessarily that there is gender equality, but at least there is a strong foundation for this. And also something that is really important, that is linked to the large-scale invasion and that will have an impact on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, is also the EU accession of process, because in fact, with the EU accession, Ukraine is actually mandated now to have a stronger legal commitment to address gender-based violence, to align with European standards. For the first time last year, we had a gender equality index that followed the EGE methodology, and so there is more work done, towards, let's say, European standards that align more with the women, peace and security agenda. And so it has changed. Yeah, it has changed profoundly, I think. So yeah, we have seen, as I say, greater, visibility of women's roles, expanded policy scope, and also the stronger legal framework. Ukraine, after the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, and also because of the US action, has already started to amend laws on gender-based violence, on domestic violence, and they are already implementing. They're already implementing through training, these laws, and this is very important.
Yes, indeed. I think we have to conclude, but again, we really appreciated your answers, your insights, also from someone who is from the field. So I hope that your experience helped us and the people who will watch this video just understand that we should need to talk about this more, because peace, as you said, is not just about the resolution of a conflict, but is about the building of a better society. And also for women, I really like the point that you raise of building a peace continuum, not just a violence continuum. And so we really hope that this contributed to the point and gave a better understanding of this to all of the people who will watch this. I think we can conclude now. Thank you once again for me and on Camilla's side, and thank you for the watchers on ITSS.
Thank you very much to you, and thank you for inviting me.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Piga, for your insightful answers.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you soon. Thank you.